If you go from the micronutrient perspective, the vitamins and minerals, those recommendations are primarily based on data from men. The first ever study we had to directly measure protein requirements in pregnancy was done in 2015. That found that protein requirements, particularly in late pregnancy, were off by over 70%. They were like more than 70% too low to actually meet the demands of protein requirements in pregnancies. The number one predictor of low micronutrient intake is the intake of refined carbohydrates. The most nutrient-dense foods on the planet are animal foods, no exception. And then the big elephant in the room is, well, that might result in ketones, and the widely held concept is that ketones harm neurodevelopment, will harm baby's brain development, and therefore it's unsafe.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. It's Caitlin from the Carnivore Couple. Today, we are joined by Registered Dietitian and Certified Diabetes Educator, Lily Nichols. Lily has dedicated her life to diving into the research on nutrition and uncovering the lies we have been told about nutrition during pregnancy. She has used her knowledge to help countless women prevent and treat their gestational diabetes, as well as help women have healthier pregnancies. As a pregnant mom of twins, I'm so excited to share this conversation with you to shed some light on how these nutritional guidelines in pregnancy were created, why they need to be changed, and whether or not ketosis and keto or carnivore is safe during pregnancy. Let's get into it. For those in our audience who are not very familiar with you, can you just kind of share about what inspired you to become a dietitian and a diabetes educator?
Interestingly, I thought that when I went into the nutrition field, I would work on child nutrition. At the time, I was really interested in how we could reduce the rates of childhood obesity and the diabetes epidemic that we were seeing among children. So I thought when I went into nutrition, like I'll reform school lunch policy or something like that. Lo and behold, I ended up in the prenatal space after, getting my dietitian credential. And what really lit me up about this field and kept me doing this work is the work I did with women with gestational diabetes and how we can reduce the risk of potential adverse outcomes on their baby and also on them, both during their pregnancy and many, many years postpartum, because it is a potential risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes later in life. So it's kind of like the warning light coming on in your car. It's like, okay, we got to do something about this. And I found it very rewarding to work with that population in particular. I mean, as you know, being currently pregnant, there's never a time in your life, I think, that you're more motivated to really take care of yourself, to the best of your ability as symptoms allow, but still there's underlying motivation there. What has kind of kept me in the field is uncovering that a lot of our guidelines for pregnancy nutrition, for treating gestational diabetes, are really not as evidence-based as you would hope. They're sometimes not really well matched to this time period because they may be encouraging you to eat a certain macronutrient ratio that doesn't really work for blood sugar management, or limit certain foods because they're, quote, too high in fat or something like that. And so my forte is looking closely at the research, saying where did these guidelines come from? Is there really truly evidence to support them? Could we be doing better? And that really stemmed from my clinical experience in gestational diabetes. I was a good little dietitian at the beginning and I followed the guidelines and it was not helping my clients' blood sugar levels. And so I was like, okay, we gotta rethink this. We have to do better. And that's why I do the work that I do to this day, and also write about it in my books to help people really implement the information and help make sure that clinicians understand that there is actually pretty large evidence base behind the things that I write about.
I love how you spoke to the guidelines, because that is actually one of my biggest questions for you to kind of talk about, because I feel like a lot of pregnant women, we don't know what these guidelines are. So could you just speak to what are the current guidelines for nutrition in pregnancy, but then also how are those guidelines created?
Yeah, so the guidelines for pregnancy are a offshoot really of our standard dietary guidelines, which are fraught with errors and conflicts of interest. I mean, they're really built on some shaky evidence from the standpoint that we need to minimize dietary fat by any means possible, especially saturated fat and cholesterol from animal foods, because research from back in the 1960s that was, highly biased and poor methodology said that those things would give you heart disease. Therefore, all of our dietary guidelines are really based on that premise, even if that connection has been widely disputed with newer research. That really is the premise underlying all of the dietary guidelines. The pregnancy ones are sort of built off of those. So the macronutrient ratios that are recommended are an offshoot from those. In some instances, they will increase the recommendations for certain macronutrients because there's an increased caloric requirement in pregnancy. So they'll be like, okay, because you need approximately this many more calories per day, and we're assuming that this percent of your calories is coming from these 3 macronutrients, therefore you need X amount additional protein, X amount additional carbohydrates. They usually still want you to limit your fat intake, so they don't go there telling you to eat more fat. But, that's really sort of the basis for the recommendations. If you go from the micronutrient perspective, the vitamins and minerals, those recommendations are primarily based on data from men, really vast majority. So there was actually a fairly large analysis published just a few years ago looking at the research studies that underscored the vitamin and mineral recommendations in pregnancy. And it was something like only 5% of the participants across all of the 700 plus studies used to set those recommendations even had a single pregnant participant. Okay, so the vast majority of the data is under the assumption that women are slightly smaller than men, and then there's a slightly larger requirement for nutrients over the course of pregnancy. And so a lot of times they're just mathematical estimates, in other words. So it's kind of shocking when you really dive into it, but our evidence for the recommendations we have is really, really quite limited.
So when you talk about the macronutrient recommendations for pregnancy, what are kind of those splits of macronutrients that they currently recommend?
So they currently recommend 45 to 65% of your calories come from carbohydrates, and they warn you not to eat less than 175 grams of carbohydrates per day specifically. That's talked about a lot in the gestational diabetes space. Protein recommendations, they give you a range, like 10 to 35% of calories, or they may give you like a gram per body weight calculation. And then fat, they're usually recommending to keep below 30 to 35% of calories from fat. I think what people don't understand when they hear these percentages, like 30% of calories from fat doesn't sound that low, right? But when you actually put that into real world food in like a food diary and calculate out the nutrients, I mean, trying to get below 30% of calories from fat means that every single time you're eating, you are choosing the low fat or fat-free option. You're doing fat-free mayonnaise. You're not putting butter on your bread. You're not cooking with fat. You're cutting the fat off of your meat. You're taking the skin off the chicken. It really is actually quite strict. I don't think people get that until they start looking at things in real world, like nutrient analyses. 30% doesn't sound low, but it is actually really, really strict.
So then you've kind of really dived into all of this research. So if you were going to try to look at what you've looked at so far and looking at these new research studies, if you were going to propose new guidelines for pregnancy nutrition, some macronutrients, what would you be recommending?
Well, first and foremost, I'd be recommending more protein. So the first ever study we had to directly measure protein requirements in pregnancy was done in 2015. That data still has not made it into updated guidelines at the time of recording here. And that found that protein requirements, particularly in late pregnancy, were off by over 70%. They were like more than 70% too low to actually meet the demands of protein requirements in pregnancy. So I would be bumping those up quite a bit, arguably close to doubling, or at least 50% more protein than what's currently recommended, or like they say, 70%. I would be reducing the carbohydrate load and emphasizing quality carbohydrates over, the old adage, half your grains whole, which is really saying like half your grains as refined white flour products is perfectly fine. Like that's really not optimal. We know the number one predictor of low micronutrient intake, meaning vitamins and minerals, is the intake of refined carbohydrates. And already Americans are getting close to 2/3 of their caloric intake from refined carbohydrates. We have a problem, okay? So we don't need to encourage more refined carbs. People will find a way to eat them. But as a whole, I think we need to be reducing the carbohydrate amount and then also focusing on the quality. So you're actually getting micronutrients with the carbs that you do happen to eat. And then I think we need to stop being so strict on dietary fat. And that doesn't have to mean adding fat to every single thing, like in large amounts. Like you don't have to add like half a stick of butter to your coffee in the morning or something. It simply means not taking the fat out of everything that has fat, okay? Like leaving the skin on your chicken, leaving the fat on your steak. Yes, cooking with some fat when you make food because that makes it taste good, not being so worried that you're having like nut butter or something. I mean, we're at the point where we have like, defatted peanut butter powder. Like, oh, come on, like we've kind of gone insane with the fat stuff. So just not being so restrictive on that naturally not only means you'll be eating more fat, but you actually get more nutrients with it because a lot of nutrient dense foods just so happen to also contain fat. And when we're demonizing those foods so much, we again start to contribute to lower micronutrient intake.
So if you had to assign like percentiles, they've assigned some type of percentiles, for some pregnancy guidelines. What percentiles would you assign to this, higher protein, fat, carbohydrate kind of diet for pregnancy?
I rarely think in terms of percentages because I feel like it's really hard to translate a percentage into food in front of you. So I usually give like gram recommendations for protein and carbohydrates, and then fat fills in the remainder. But to think of it in terms of percent of calories, I'd say on average, and there may be differences for different people, we're all individual, but probably more like 15 to 30% of calories from carbohydrates, 20 to 30 or even 35% of calories from protein, and then the remainder from fat.
One of the things that I've really been looking into, as you mentioned, micronutrients and macronutrients. And for me, I'm just trying to, eat healthy and higher protein and then fill in with some vegetables and things like that. How can women actually track the nutrients that they are getting during pregnancy if they're worried about filling any gaps in their diet?
The easiest way would be to actually track and write it down. So there are free software out there, like Chronometer is one of my favorite ones, no affiliation, where you can input your food intake and then it'll spit out full nutrient analysis. So not just calories and macronutrients, because a lot of the other trackers are only giving you that information. This also collates all your micronutrient intake as well. You do have to keep in mind that their sort of goal level of micronutrients is set to just a general adult. So you might want to, at the very least, even though our recommendations aren't perfect, set your micronutrient levels to the ones that are specific to pregnancy. So you're getting an accurate read, like, okay, I met, 75% of my iron needs. Well, did you put in the iron needs for pregnancy? Because they're higher, right? So you might want to adjust those to make sure that what is output is actually more or less accurate, even if many of these goals should actually be a lot higher. But I digress. That'll at least give you a decent proxy. I don't think everybody needs to be tracking all the time, every meal. Like that can kind of contribute to disordered eating in some individuals. It totally depends. But as an occasional check-in for a day or 2 or 3 to see where you're at, see which nutrients you may be falling low on. And then you can work to kind of tweak your food intake to be increasing that amount. So for example, like, oh, I'm falling really low on potassium. Well, that might be a sign that you want to increase your potassium-rich foods. And maybe if I was looking at a nutrient analysis, I'd be like, okay, well, I see like a sandwich coming in at lunch, which is providing a fair amount of carbohydrates, but low potassium. If you swapped that out for potatoes, yeah, they're still high carb, like the carb intake may be about the same, but you'd be getting a lot more potassium with it, right? So you can do swaps where you kind of like keep the macronutrients at the same level, or somebody who's low carb might be swapping in something like more avocados and such to boost up the potassium levels while keeping the carbs low.
And you mentioned, you can set like an app like Chronometer. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong.
I'm probably pronouncing it wrong too.
But I know I was looking into that, like kind of comparing a keto and carnivore diet, and you can set your micronutrients to certain levels. But one thing, like you mentioned, is that they just are automatically set for someone who's not pregnant. So how do I even find a micronutrient guideline of what I should try to be achieving? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you'd search the internet for dietary reference intakes for pregnancy or recommended dietary allowances for pregnancy, RDA or DRI, and it should take you to like an Institute of Medicine chart of some sort that'll spit out those numbers for you.
So one of the nutrients that I feel like we focus a lot on, and I've read a lot about in your books, the kind of the difference between the two is like folate and folic acid. Could you speak to the difference between those two and why they're important?
Folate it's a confusing conversation. Folate is really an umbrella term that encapsulates all the different types of folate. We have 150 different types of folate, at least that we know of, identified in food. The vast majority of what's in food is called methylfolate. And then that also encompasses the folate that we may be getting in supplementation, or the folate that is fortified in foods. And what is most typical for supplements and fortified foods is folic acid. And folic acid is a man-made type of folate. It does not occur in nature. It does not occur in any of our foods naturally. It is only there if it has been fortified. So the challenge with folic acid is our body does have to convert it in our cells to methylfolate in order for it to be metabolically usable by our body. So 95 to 98% of the folate in our bloodstream, in umbilical cord blood, which is baby's blood supply, in our own red blood cells, is in the form of methylfolate. That is the preferred form. So when you're taking in folic acid, your body has to be able to do the work to do the conversion. The challenge is that our bodies really can only convert a fairly limited amount of folic acid on a day-to-day basis. It's somewhere in the range of about 300 micrograms per day. This is actually below what the RDA is, just so people know. And so if you're taking in folic acid from fortified foods, somebody who's low carb probably wouldn't be getting much of that because they're not eating refined grains. The number one place we find synthetic folic acid in our diets is fortified grains because they fortify the enriched grains with folic acid and several other nutrients. And then the remaining folic acid is coming in from supplemental sources typically. So if we exceed that amount, you may be getting to the point where your body cannot make use of all of it. And then it just floats around in your system doing who knows what. They call it unmetabolized folic acid. We really don't have clear answers on what it's doing in the body if it's not put to use. But there has been some concerns raised over connections to the development of autism in children and potentially contributing to the development of certain cancers and other things. But we really don't have super clear answers on that yet. The other point about folic acid is that depending on your genetics, some people have an even greater challenge in metabolizing folic acid. So if you have a gene mutation called MTHFR, there are different types, some of them more severe than others, but at the very least, there is a reduced ability for your body to convert folic acid into methylfolate. And so those individuals in particular need to be sure that they're taking in plenty of whole food sourced folate, which naturally is in the form of methylfolate. So spinach, asparagus, liver, legumes and beans and peas, beets, those sorts of things. Sunflower seeds are also pretty high. Those foods will provide you with methylfolate. Or if you're supplementing, you would want to be supplementing with methylfolate instead of folic acid. Because if you just keep adding lots and lots of folic acid, which is actually sadly kind of a common conventional recommendation, you can actually worsen the folate deficiency because you're kind of clogging up these like metabolic systems. You're clogging up the biochemistry and it can't process it. It can't make use of it. So it actually creates more issues than it solves in some individuals.
So if someone is wanting to supplement with methylfolate instead of folic acid, where would you find that? And how do you know that it would be good per se?
Well, you'd have to like look at the supplement itself. So for example, there's some prenatal vitamins that now use methylfolate instead of folic acid. Seeking Health has one, Fullwell has one. You can get methylfolate supplements on their own on the side, separate from a comprehensive prenatal. Although if you just get a really good quality prenatal, then you don't have to be taking a million supplements. You just take that. But you want to look at the actual like supplement facts panel and see what is the source of folate. So it can say folate, and then it'll usually have to have in parentheses, if they're following FDA labeling laws, it has to tell you what form that nutrient came from. So it could say folate in parentheses, folic acid. You know that supplement is giving you folic acid, not methylfolate. But if it says folate and in parentheses methylfolate, then you know it's methylfolate. The confusing part is there are a lot of different types of or like chemical names for describing methylfolate, and that makes it a little bit complicated because it can be 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate or 5-MTHF or S5-MTHF. There's different ways of writing it out, but as long as it doesn't say folic acid and you see the word methyl somewhere in there, a pretty good sign that you're getting methylfolate. Dr. Ben Lynch does have, if you Google his name and Google methylfolate or names of folate, you'll get an article from him that lists all the various names that they come under, where you still know for sure this is methylfolate.
Thank you for explaining that in such detail, because that really matters if you're trying to, go the methylfolate route, but you don't have anywhere to look. And I feel like, when I'm speaking with my OBGYN, that's not a topic that usually comes up. And so it's really helpful to know some resources about where to find this and how to know what I'm taking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do, by the way, have an article on my website on the folate versus folic acid debate. It's a pretty long and lengthy article, so like take your time to read through it. But that also includes a list of the food sources and the quantity of folate that they have. So if you're trying to optimize the intake from your diet, you also have that information. But I also link out to many more resources on folate and supplementation, and even like, a full-on professional webinar on the topic for people who really want to like really get like super informed on this topic. LilyNicholsRDN.com.
Okay. Yeah. So make sure to go check out her website. I've read so many articles on your website, especially with my history kind of preeclampsia, looking at different articles you've written on that and the nutrient deficiencies sometimes that go along with that. So yes, your website is wonderful and a wealth of knowledge. So definitely want to push people there. Another question I had, kind of focusing on this macronutrient of carbohydrates as we kind of switch gears into ketosis and pregnancy and things like that. Are carbohydrates essential for pregnancy? And then does this vary based on trimester?
Yeah, the concept of whether or not they're essential is somewhat debatable. So just to level set before we dive into the controversy of ketones in pregnancy, I am not of the opinion that everybody needs to be limiting their carbohydrates as much as humanly possible just for the sake of doing so or for the sake of achieving ketosis or something like that. But I became interested in carbohydrate requirements in pregnancy from my work with women with gestational diabetes, because oftentimes the standard recommendations of 175 grams of carbs per day is too much, honestly, for many of these women to maintain glycemic control. So my question wasn't, can we go keto safely? My question was, can we reduce carbohydrates to a level where they can maintain healthy blood sugar control? And then the big elephant in the room is, well, that might result in ketones. And the widely held concept is that ketones harm neurodevelopment, will harm baby's brain development, and therefore it's unsafe. So really the whole reason I even wrote my first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, was to debunk that claim with the literature. Since that came out 9 years ago, there's a lot more research now published on this, better defining and backing up pretty much everything that I say in that book, but better defining like what we know and don't know about ketones in pregnancy. My opinion on carbohydrates is that they do provide you with some essential nutrients, even though the most nutrient dense foods on the planet are animal foods, with the exception of leafy greens, which also are quite nutrient dense. The rest of the most nutrient dense foods are animal foods, like no exception, and they fill in the vast majority of micronutrient deficiencies and requirements for pregnancy. So I'm very pro omnivorous diet, but I don't usually take it to the level that we need to take out carbohydrates completely. I think we need to focus more on carbohydrate quality. But the question as to whether you can safely go low carb, you can. My experience is that when you drop carbohydrates below about 75 grams of total carbs per day, this is where it starts to get a little challenging for certain micronutrients. It can start to get challenging for, again, depending on the dietary makeup, but it can start to get challenging for vitamin C, for magnesium, for folate, for potassium. So again, depending on what the rest of the diet is made up of, because we do have people who eat a very high proportion of their calories from animal foods, but they're including like organ meats and shellfish and stuff. And those are really nutrient dense. That fills in more of the gaps. Or maybe they're consuming, this is controversial in pregnancy, but some of their animal foods raw, therefore getting some vitamin C in there, right? So it totally depends. But generally speaking, I do tend to try not to go below about 75 total grams of carbs. It's rare, very, very, very rare in my experience that I have a client who needs to restrict beyond that for blood sugar management in pregnancy. We're almost always able to achieve it just by quality of carbohydrates. Also, I am of the opinion that it is beneficial for your body to have some fiber coming in, which you're only going to get if you're consuming some carbohydrates and consuming the higher quality carbohydrates that are more nutrient dense, because those naturally have fiber. So that helps with your body like binding and excreting toxins. It helps with your body excreting excess estrogen that has been metabolized and then needs to be removed from your system. It also can help with bowel regularity. I know some people have, differences of opinion on that and different experiences. By all means, do what works best for you. But vast majority of my client experience is that people do better when they have some fiber, even if their fiber is only coming in from berries and non-starchy vegetables and some nuts and seeds. Like they're still pretty low carb, but that does seem to provide some benefits for them as well.
I love how you mentioned not focusing on carbohydrates specifically, but looking at what type of nutrients are you getting and then how that impacts your insulin sensitivity. I came from the carnivore space. I was carnivore for a little bit, but then really focused on eating just meat and greens. This is before I was pregnant. But then when I got pregnant, I was really looking into kind of putting different foods into Chronometer and seeing, what are the nutrient deficiencies if I were to stay carnivore, or what did my nutrients look like if I, ate really high protein animal based foods, but added in some of those leafy greens and berries. And like you were saying, I found the same types of things. I'd be lower in that folate, I'd be lower in vitamin C, I'd be lower in magnesium. And so that really pushed me towards, keeping high protein, but then adding in those other things. So, and that's been really successful for me so far.
Yeah. And even when you look sort of ancestrally at populations that did traditionally eat really low carb, like you look at the Inuit and, Alaska and Greenland, and I've actually lived in Alaska before, so I have some experience with that sort of climate. By default, you can't really eat a whole lot of plant foods in the winter if you're entirely subsisting on the land. Traditionally, their diet was like 3 to 15% of calories coming from carbohydrates. But interestingly, when you dive into some of their like cultural texts that have been written about like what the foods that, the Alutiiq people who lived in the Aleutian Islands, like what did they eat? Like they would gather a lot of plant foods in the summer months. The summer's short, but they would go crazy gathering all the berries. And the wild berries up there, by the way, are not particularly sweet. Like they're not high carb by default comparative to, a blueberry we'd get in the lower 48, but still they would go to great lengths to harvest as many plant foods as possible and then preserve them for the winter. So they would gather all these berries and preserve them in seal oil or dry them or, process them into different, shelf stable options, but they would still eat them during winter. So even in areas where you're like, oh, these people are obligate carnivores, they're like pretty close to it, but they're still like whatever plant foods they have available, you can bet they are going to be eating them, and they're going to try to find a way to like have those for subsistence later on. So yeah, we can like acknowledge that animal foods are super nutrient dense, and we also don't have to get so dogmatic that now we can't eat plants, right? You can have the best of both worlds, really. I think for most people.
Yes, exactly. I couldn't agree more. A lot of people talk about how we eat ancestrally and, then that kind of turns into the carnivore space. But I got to say, if somebody saw a berry sitting on a bush, they're not going to deny it if they're trying to live. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So,
Yeah,
yeah, I couldn't
totally.
agree more with you. But yeah, let's dive into this kind of keto talk during pregnancy. So, there are different types of ketosis. So, what are the different types, and how does maternal ketosis affect the growing baby?
So there are different types of ketosis, and an important point for people to realize is that the general medical world is not familiar with all the nuances on ketosis. I can even tell you as myself with my training and even as a diabetes educator, you go through this huge diabetic textbook on all the things, and any mention of ketosis is in the context of diabetic ketoacidosis. And so most healthcare practitioners, maybe this is shifting a little more in recent years, but I would tell you for the vast majority, if they hear the word ketosis or ketones, they think of it in the context of a total medical emergency situation of diabetic ketoacidosis. But there are different kinds. And diabetic ketoacidosis, I'll start with that since I already went there, is a total medical emergency. It's typically seen in type 1 diabetes, occasionally in insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes. And this is due to somebody not taking enough insulin. This is a situation where this person's body is not able to produce enough insulin to cover their needs, so they have to take what they call exogenous insulin or take insulin shots. We know for sure this type of ketosis harms neurodevelopment. It's been very well documented that diabetic ketoacidosis is highly, highly dangerous. Like I said, it's a medical emergency. Your blood sugar levels are extremely high. Your blood becomes extremely acidic, and you have really, really high blood ketone levels, anywhere from like 5 to 200 times more than normal. It's been known that this is harmful to neurodevelopment for decades. There's no question about that. But this really only occurs in those very specific scenarios I just mentioned, in somebody with pre-existing insulin or pre-existing diabetes rather, where they have really not enough insulin production by their own body. But in pregnancy, we're in a hyperinsulinemic state. If you have a functioning pancreas or a semi-functioning pancreas, you are producing really high amounts of insulin over the course of pregnancy. So you're not going to develop DKA in pregnancy, typically, outside of those specific scenarios. The other types of ketosis are starvation ketosis. So this is when somebody is not eating enough food at all. So they are not eating enough calories. By definition, this is a problem because your diet is depleted not only in enough energy, but essential fatty acids, amino acids, vitamins, minerals, micronutrients, antioxidants. You're starving. This has also been well known for decades to cause harm to neurodevelopment. Even in the absence of ketosis necessarily, they're like thinking of it outside of that context, just starving yourself is like obviously harmful. Okay, we're like, this is not a good idea in pregnancy when you're growing a brand new human being from scratch in your body. The third type of ketosis that can occur is called nutritional ketosis or physiologic ketosis. And this is a mild level of ketosis in somebody who's taking in enough food, they're eating enough energy, but they may be eating a lower amount of carbohydrates. This is a situation that actually happens very frequently in pregnancy. Even those who are not necessarily trying to stay low carb, your body really readily goes into ketosis quickly when you're pregnant. It is built into our physiology that it switches into ketosis quicker in pregnancy than it does outside of pregnancy. Anybody who's been trying a ketogenic diet and has been tracking their ketones pre-pregnancy they may be shocked when they're in pregnancy, still maybe now eating more carbs, and they're still going into ketosis. They're going into it quicker, like you go into it between meals sometimes. Certainly with an overnight fast, you're like 3 times more likely to wake up and be in nutritional ketosis when you're pregnant than when you're not pregnant. But this is not necessarily harmful per se. It's just your body is tapping into fat metabolism more readily in pregnancy, and it becomes more notable the further along you get in pregnancy, the more your body is switching to this catabolic state. You've accrued maternal fat stores over the course of pregnancy, and your body is smart. It knows how to tap into different fuel sources. So if there's any shortage in the amount of, food coming in, and that could mean even like a break between meals or carbohydrate intake is a little bit low, your body knows how to also burn fat for fuel. And a consequence of that is the release of ketones. So we now have quite a bit of evidence now that has shown that maternal ketosis is actually quite normal, especially in later pregnancy. It is not harmful to fetal brain development. If it was, everybody would be having kids with brain issues, because literally every single pregnant woman will go into ketosis at some point in her pregnancy. There's also, interestingly, a recent paper that came out. It was I believe it was a 2024 paper where they looked at carb intake in pregnancy and ketone levels. And they actually did not find a correlation between carb intake and ketone levels. Almost everybody had detectable levels of ketones over the course of pregnancy, on average ranging pretty close to the nutritional ketosis cutoff, like upwards of like 0.3 millimoles per liter. And I certainly know many, many women who have had ketone levels full on in like nutritional ketosis range in pregnancy, and they have brilliantly smart and healthy babies. So our obsessive concern over this sort of physiologically normal state in pregnancy is quite silly, in my opinion, but it still persists. I still hear from women every single week, my doctor's concerned because I'm testing positive for urine ketones, and they're saying I'm not eating enough carbs, but if I eat more carbs, my blood sugar gets worse. And there's still this fear mongering out there, even though it's unfounded.
So just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, when you're in nutritional ketosis, your body is burning fat as fuel. And the difference between that and starvation ketosis is, in starvation ketosis, your body is still burning the fat for fuel, but you are not getting enough calories. Is that correct?
In starvation ketosis, correct. You're not getting enough food as a whole. So all of the ketones that your body is producing is from burning your own body fat for fuel. Whereas in nutritional ketosis, sure, you can dip into maternal fat stores. That is built into our physiological design for pregnancy, but you're also burning dietary fat for fuel as well. Like if you're eating at a slightly lower carb intake, you are eating proportionally more fat in your diet. So some of that will also result in ketone production.
And so that's probably why they say it's not safe to lose weight during pregnancy, because then you're kind of dipping probably into that starvation ketosis and using your body's fat as fuel. Is that correct?
That could be one of the considerations, but even that notion has been challenged recently. We have, again, a fairly large body of data now showing that we should be rethinking our weight gain recommendations for pregnancy, because we have, the vast majority of the US population is at a heavier BMI. And so the question is whether we should still be recommending the same amount of weight gain for all women, and particularly for those who have a pre-pregnancy BMI over 30. We have some data showing that no weight gain, limited weight gain, or even in some instances weight loss over the course of pregnancy is associated with the lowest risks to maternal and infant health. So we see less gestational diabetes, less preeclampsia, less babies that are larger than average or macrosomic, less C-sections, less, the list like adds up, less preterm birth. So it really depends on where a person's weight is preconception, like what is going to be the right amount for them to gain. Because women who are underweight, per the guidelines, we actually should maybe be recommending they gain even more than what the guidelines are at. But women who are at the other side of the BMI range, they might benefit from more limited weight gain than what the guidelines suggest. So yes, that has widely been the opinion. You don't want to lose weight over the course of pregnancy, but it totally depends, because there are some instances where it is actually of benefit. And I've actually worked with a large population of women who fall into that category. Statistically, there's a higher risk of gestational diabetes at higher BMIs. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, I think on the outside, people think like, oh, someone who's losing weight in pregnancy, like they're starving themselves for sure, right? And I never recommended a caloric deficit ever in my life in pregnancy with any client ever, right? They're getting enough calories, but we've been working on improving the quality of their diet, eating to satiety. By improving the macronutrient balance, we help with their blood sugar levels. And it's like by default, they just don't gain as much weight over the course of pregnancy. But I can tell you, they are, if anything, better nourished than they've ever been in their life. Their body is just like metabolically becoming healthier in that pregnancy. And so excess weight is lost in the process. And as their insulin levels come down in proportion to their glucose levels, you also lose a fair amount of water weight, because insulin makes you hold on to water weight too. So that's another part of the coin. As insulin and inflammation comes down, you shed the excess water weight.
So overall, some of these new research studies are showing that a nutritional ketosis is safe during pregnancy.
Yes.
Is that correct? And so how did these research studies, how did they differ from some of these former studies that were saying, neural tube defects and things like that? Is that because they were more so looking at the diabetic ketoacidosis instead of nutritional ketosis?
Most of the early studies were only looking at diabetic ketoacidosis and starvation ketosis, and then correlating that with potential adverse outcomes. The primary study used to defend that ketosis is harmful to brain development is from 1991. And interestingly, when you look at that study, every study that's been published since on ketones always references the same one. And I found holes in it way back when I was looking at this stuff, 15 plus years ago. But now it's become even more clear. This was a study that measured blood ketone levels. And they said there was a correlation between slightly elevated blood ketone levels and problems with brain development. But you look at the level of ketones, and it was like extremely low, like 0.1 millimoles per liter. And now we have all this data. At the time, we didn't have like a data set on what's physiologically normal in pregnancy. We still don't necessarily have reference ranges for that, but we have several studies that have looked at that and defined that. And what do you find happens? Like ketone levels are like 0.1, 0.2 millimoles per liter. So it appears that whatever, again, that was not a study to prove causation. It was a study to show some sort of correlation, but that correlation has not held true. If this level of blood ketones is simply observed as the norm across pregnancy, and we're not seeing that this is associated with brain development outcomes, there may have been an issue with that 1991 study.
And it also, our bodies are putting on some weight during pregnancy most of the time. And it makes sense that our body would then use that to help fuel our pregnancy, especially as you said, as we're getting into that third trimester and our ketone levels just kind of naturally go up.
Right. And the concern that ketones would be problematic for infant brain development is a little bit silly, because about 30% of a baby's brain energy needs are actually met by ketones. And there are certain lipids within the brain that are created from ketones. Ketone levels in the placenta are maintained at higher levels than mom or baby. Baby's ketone levels are usually maintained at higher levels than mom's circulation. And babies are naturally born in ketosis, which is how they can survive this transition between mom's milk transitioning from colostrum to mature milk, they're taking in very, very small amounts of colostrum, not enough for their energy needs, but they are primed to mobilize their fat stores for energy. And the biggest issue that we see with babies adapting to new life is if they have been born to a mom who has poor blood sugar control, that baby has been a sugar burner, not a fat burner. And they go hypoglycemic. Their insulin levels are too high, and they've not been adapted to use ketones for fuel. And they really have trouble meeting their energy needs and being what we'd consider for an adult, like metabolically flexible. A newborn baby is in very deep ketosis, especially in like days like 2 to 4 post-birth, as they're in that transitional stage between colostrum and mature milk. So it's really silly when we think about it, because it's like, okay, we have documentation that babies are in ketosis post-birth. We're assuming that in pregnancy somehow it's harming their brain, but like the minute they come out of the womb, then now they can use ketones perfectly fine. And it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold up to basic logic. But I don't think a lot of people have really like thought through the the whole progression here.
Kind of switching into the gestational diabetes and pregnancy conversation. So, why does gestational diabetes happen, and can you prevent it?
Yes, it's a good question. $1 million question, really. So, gestational diabetes happens when your body has a challenge adapting to the demands of pregnancy. It really is pregnancy is a stress test on your system. You have higher insulin production over the course of pregnancy because insulin resistance goes up in later pregnancy. So your body naturally knows that this will happen and starts pumping out more insulin. You have placental hormones that play a role in this. You also have weight gain, and the weight gain naturally drives insulin resistance. But interestingly, if all systems are working well, the body does adapt to this. Insulin production goes up enough to cover the increased insulin resistance, and actually maternal blood sugar levels range in a healthy woman. They actually are lower than outside of pregnancy. So if your body can like meet that stress test, you're good. Even though people talk about pregnancy, it's an insulin resistant state, it's a diabetic state. Not really, because your body is meant to overcome it and keep your blood sugar in a healthy range. But if there's a pre-existing level of insulin resistance, or maybe your pancreas is not able to increase the amount of insulin required to overcome that physiological insulin resistance, that's where you run into problems. And what I've seen in practice, we used to screen with hemoglobin A1C in the first trimester to see like where somebody is at. It is part of the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program guidelines to screen first trimester. So in our clinics, we always did. And the vast majority of gestational diabetic cases, we would actually catch early because these were women who were already pre-diabetic. So population-wide, half of the US, arguably more now, is diabetic or pre-diabetic. Many don't even know it. Many times we're not testing outside of pregnancy. Pregnancy is simply a time that we happen to be catching it. So I know people think of gestational diabetes as diabetes that develops during pregnancy, as if it is a consequence of the physiology of pregnancy. And yes, of course, that plays some role, but the majority of cases really have some predisposition to it. And we're first recognizing a blood sugar issue in pregnancy. Maybe something that was more subtle pre-pregnancy was never caught or never tested, but we are catching it in pregnancy. Whether it can be avoided is that's the $1 million question, right? And I do try to do everything within my power to help women, avoid it, or if they develop it, manage it with as little, outside intervention as possible, like using food and lifestyle as much as you can. And a lot of the same things you do for management also cross over for prevention. So eating a sufficient amount of protein is really key. In order for your pancreas to produce that larger amount of insulin later in pregnancy, you've got to have good intake of protein. Exercise and movement. If you're active pre-pregnancy and through upwards of like the first half of your pregnancy at minimum, we see upwards of like a 79% reduced risk of developing gestational diabetes. When you use your muscles, they're hungry for fuel and they pull glucose out of your bloodstream, and they help your body be more insulin sensitive over the long term. So exercise is great. A number of micronutrients play a role in blood sugar levels. A lot of our electrolytes, especially potassium and magnesium, sodium, play a role. Vitamin D, certain B vitamins, especially thiamine, chromium. There's a number of nutrients that also play a role. So the more nutrient dense foods you're consuming, the better. We have some decent data on inositol. It's a B vitamin-like compound that helps with insulin resistance. It's been studied for polycystic ovarian syndrome. Those women typically have some level of insulin resistance. They're more at risk for gestational diabetes. That is used in many studies to help improve their insulin resistance, their ovulatory function, help them get pregnant. And that we have trials that have continued inositol supplementation during pregnancy for both prevention and also for treatment of gestational diabetes. And those are generally pretty positive results on those studies. Circadian rhythm, like, are you getting up when it's like bright and sunny outside and getting some morning light exposure and then going to sleep at a decent hour? Like, your sleep plays a role, your stress plays a role, like so many things affect your blood sugar levels. So much of that advice, things that we're often doing during pregnancy, or, even outside of pregnancy, you can apply that in the preconception window to try to get your blood sugar and insulin levels at a healthy as possible level preconception, and continue that during your pregnancy to hopefully, reduce that risk.
I think it's so important how you mentioned, preparing your body, and that most of the gestational diabetes cases that you're talking about are that you're discovering that they've already had some type of pre-diabetes. And it blows my mind, honestly, that we don't use, like, at least where I live, they don't use the A1C test for everybody. They just do that one drink test, which only
Right.
tells you how your body is reacting on a one time, not based on the last 3 months.
Yeah, and to clarify on A1C, 'cause I literally just got a message this morning from somebody that they had a history of gestational diabetes, and they're working with a midwife this time, and they had them do an A1C in the first trimester, and then they just simply repeated an A1C in the third trimester. And it was lower in the third trimester, and great, but she's checking her blood sugar at home and her post-meal readings are often high. And so she's worried that she actually might have gestational diabetes after all. The clarification on A1C is it is only considered a diagnostic standard in the first trimester. As you get later in pregnancy, A1C naturally goes down, as it should. It's actually a big problem if it's not going down, because your red blood cells turn over faster. A1C is measuring how much of the hemoglobin in your red blood cell has been glycated by sugar. Your blood is also more dilute in pregnancy, so that plays a role. But all of that means your A1C naturally is going to be almost like falsely low later on. So you can use it as a first trimester proxy, but you do need to consider what you're going to do at that 24 to 28 week mark for a screening. Like, if your A1C comes out high first trimester, you really should be watching your blood sugar the remainder of the pregnancy. Again, by some criteria, that's considered diagnostic of gestational diabetes, even though it's really like pre-diabetes that we caught during pregnancy, but you know what I mean. But if that A1C is normal in the first trimester, you still need to have some sort of a plan for checking. And if it's not the glucose tolerance test, which, believe me, I know all the pros and cons and all the reasons people don't want to do it. I go into this in detail in chapter 9 of Real Food for Pregnancy in the lab test chapter. But you do want to choose something else then if you're not going to do the glucola. And my opinion is your best option, if you're not going to do it, is home monitoring for like a week or two and see how is your body responding to food, and test out, by the way, some high carb meals too, to see how your body responds. The point of the glucose tolerance test is to see how well your body tolerates this large bolus of glucose. And yes, it's a bit unnatural. Hopefully no one's eating like 50 or 100 grams of pure sugar at one time, although many Americans do. But if you're not going to do that, you still want to have some meals that are pretty high carb to see how your body tolerates that. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter whether there's a diagnosis on the paper or not. what matters is that you're keeping your blood sugar in a good range, right? And so if you don't want to do the diagnostic test, then you better keep an eye on it yourself and see how you're doing. And I mean, second pregnancy, I'm not doing a glucola. I monitored my blood sugar myself, right? You can do that. You might have some headbutts with your provider, depending on who you're working with. But I do want to make that point that A1C in later pregnancy, really, you can't use it as a diagnostic.
I love how you mentioned monitoring at home, because I was just nervous about the glucose test for my 24 to 28 week appointment, but we have a glucose monitor at home. So, I ate some whole wheat pasta and then checked it, and it was fine. And that just gave me peace of mind. And then now, even though I passed my gestational diabetes test, I still periodically check it, just to see how things are going and see how my body's handling that. I think that's really great advice.
Yeah, it's the proactive choice. And by the way, I'll point out there is some kind of interesting data on twin pregnancies that maybe we don't need to be quite as strict on blood sugar goals in twin pregnancies. So I'll throw that out there and give you a little more peace of mind. It's thought that maybe the maternal body is trying to mobilize more fuel because you're growing two babies at once. So the same adverse effects at the singleton pregnancies has not necessarily been shown in twin pregnancies. Blood sugar can be just a wee bit higher and still be okay, to offer you some more reassurance.
That's helpful to know. I don't know. Now that I have a twin pregnancy, I just throw everything normal out the window, I feel like.
Right? Yeah. And there's very little data on twin pregnancies. What we have is really points to just eat more food, eat a lot more protein, and more nutrient dense foods, just more. But we're really limited on the data we have on it as a whole.
Yeah. Well, I could for sure talk to you for another hour, but we are limited on time. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here for this conversation and just bringing to light how our nutrient guidelines were established and how nutritional ketosis can be actually safe during pregnancy, and that we as women can be proactive about gestational diabetes and monitoring at home and helping ourselves have healthy pregnancies. I just wanted to say, is there anything else you would like to add or any final thoughts you would like to share?
Gosh, I mean, I think we've covered most of it. If I can give one piece of sort of practical advice for people, since we've been talking a lot of theoretical stuff, almost everybody can benefit from eating a higher protein breakfast, whether or not you have gestational diabetes, but certainly in pregnancy, outside of pregnancy, preconception for improving fertility, postpartum, so you have the fuel for breastfeeding, keep your blood sugar in a good range. Do eat a protein-rich breakfast. It really does set the stage for happier blood sugar levels the rest of the day and stable, nice energy levels as well, with fewer cravings and fewer blood sugar spikes and crashes and all the annoyances that can come with that. So I do always like to leave at least one tip that's a little more practical, but certainly you can read about why that's so important for all the different things in my books. I'm sure you may have some questions about those, but people can find those up on my website.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. This is Lily Nichols. She does have 3 books, and we didn't touch on her new book, but her 3 books are Real Food for Pregnancy, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, and also your newest book, Real Food for Fertility. And you have so many resources on your website. I'll make sure to link it down below. So make sure to go check her out if you're pregnant. She's just amazing, and I'm so glad that you could be here today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. See you guys next time. Stay strong.